Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for choosing to come to the session. This is an excellent turnout, if not slightly daunting. There's so much going on at this conference that, we genuinely are really grateful that you're here. Also, a big welcome to the people who are watching on the live stream. My name is Matt. I work for the Organic Research Centre. Primarily, I work on knowledge exchange, farmer-focused, and run the Agricology website. For those who don't know, Agricology is a free online hub that provides knowledge on agroecological farming practices with a practical focus. We basically collate info from across the industry with our partners. Today's session is part of a wider piece of work that we're doing that's looking into the carrying capacity, or the optimal carrying capacity of land for livestock. And in the coming months, we'll be producing a series of podcasts that will lead on from today's discussions. This session is bringing together a fabulous panel of three who are all working to understand and manage livestock in the landscape at the optimal levels for environment, for the health of the farm, and for the health of animals. Nationally and globally, we all know that there are major issues with the way that livestock is farmed. Industrial livestock farming practices are causing major environmental degradation at an ever-increasing scale. And the brush that rightly tars these large-scale extractive livestock systems is creating a narrative that often comes down to the total removal of livestock from the landscape. We're trying to help redefine that narrative and look at livestock that's reared in a sympathetic manner, non-extractive, as an important part of ecosystems and as key participants in healthy farming systems. So what is driving the decision-making around non-extractive livestock farming? And what sort of thinking should farmers and growers be looking at as they decide to reintegrate or change how they manage livestock in their systems? Our fabulous panel are going to speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we're going to move into a bit more of an open discussion. I'll pose a couple of questions, and then we'll sort of jump between online questions and questions in the room. So please keep your questions till the end, and don't be shy. The guys are up for some feisty questions if you've got them. So to introduce the panel, we've got Dr. Lindsay Whistance. Sorry, Lindsay. Lindsay's the Senior Livestock Researcher at the Organic Research Centre, who specialises in animal behaviour and welfare. Lindsay also has a vast wealth in silvopasture. This session came out of the deep thinking that she's been doing on the subject. So it was her ideas that allowed us to bring this topic and concept together. So big thanks to her for that. Personally, I get great satisfaction from working alongside Lindsay at the Organic Research Centre, as I get to hear her analysis on the state of food and farming quite regularly. And I'm sure today what she's got to say, you will find a mixture of interesting, challenging, compassionate, and provocative. What it will definitely be is very well thought out. Next up, we've got Simon Fairlie. Sorry, Simon, I've been doing that all week. Who many of you will know. Simon is and has been many things. Micro-dairy herdsman, cheesemaker, author, editor, fisherman, stonemason, and the man who introduced Austrian scythes to the UK. He was described by The Guardian in 2022 as the most influential and unusual eco-activist you might not have heard of. But obviously, lots of you do know him. Lastly, but definitely not leastly, we've got Richard Gantlett. Richard is a biodynamic farmer who farms 550 hectares at Yatesbury in Wiltshire, where he grows a range of cereals and raises pedigree Aberdeen Angus cattle. Because he's not busy enough on the farm, Richard also has completed a PhD, carried out on doing farm research into carbon storage rates in diverse leys and cereal farming. The carbon balance on Richard's farm is 91% carbon sequestration to 9% carbon emissions. So I think he will cover a bit of that later on. He's also a part-time lecturer, visiting fellow at Reading University, and to top off his accomplishments, he has a fabulous agroecology farmer profile. So I could spend 20 minutes talking about these three, but it's better that I let them speak. So without further ado, Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much. Hopefully this works. Lower. Am I pointing it in the wrong direction? That way. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so the keener-eyed view, you'll see that I've managed to get all 4 organic principles in the title of health, ecology, fairness and care. But it still makes quite a nice sentence looking at ecological health alongside care and fairness towards farmed animals. So there are a lot of narratives around how we can manage this planet better, and it often worries me how we reduce the animals in this narrative. So let's start and have a look at what's happening around us and how we might look at the animals in a different light. So I hope we all recognise now that we are in a period of climate change. This is some of the records from the Meteorological Office showing that whilst rainfall and temperatures fluctuate quite dramatically over the recorded time period, which is from about mid-1800s, the narrative is that rainfall is going up and temperatures are also going up. So we're now 7 times more likely to get heavy and prolonged periods of rainfall in winter, and already 30 times more likely to experience summers like 2018. And by 2050, these will come every second year. This is predicted. This is, last year was our 10th consecutive year where we experienced 1 degree above the average temperatures for the pre-industrial period. So climate change is upon us. And much of this has been attributed to human behaviour. So we can see by some of the newspaper headlines from last year that I've collected here, weather changes causing chaos for our UK flora and fauna. Even if we stop producing greenhouse gases, tomorrow ocean levels are predicted to rise. Our river systems are in dire straits. Microplastics are found everywhere, and of the water samples taken of the Great Lakes, 90% of those are considered to have unsafe levels, whatever unsafe means. And even the way we build our buildings is having catastrophic effects on wildlife, with the US buildings estimated to have killed 1 billion birds last year. So these are quite strong narratives. So if we look at what's happening with the human population over time, we can see that our ability to grow more food has had huge implications on human populations. So before the agricultural revolution in the 1700s, the UK population was about 5.5 million people. By the time we started learning how to grow food in a more productive manner, 100 years later, that population is now 9 million people. And by 1900, so 200 years after that first number, we're up to 32 million. Our food choices are also changing in this time, so a higher proportion of our diet is now meat and animal products. So just tacked on the 2023 census, we've now got 68 million humans in the UK, but of course this is also attributed to human movements. Globally, we're now standing at around 8 billion people, and this is predicted to rise to around 9 billion, more than 9 billion by 2050. And from 2009 levels of food production, around a 70% increase is needed to feed that population. So this is a real challenge for us, and I would argue that it is the biggest elephant in the room. Something that I'm feeling uncomfortable raising, but nevertheless, this is part of our food problem. And as a species, I think it behoves us to look at our population levels and actually talk about it in a constructive manner rather than leave it to the, let's say, the darker elements of society to focus on this alone. So when we look at the 1900s, the practices that were used until this point and developed until this point were largely traditional practices done better, if you like, using traditional means. From the 1950s, we can see where the agricultural revolution meets the industrial revolution, and we're starting to farm using synthetic fertilizers. And you can see what that has done to the population. So this is some work that was, do I have a pointer here? Well, it doesn't really matter, but if you look at the green line, it starts at around 2 billion underneath the red line, and at 2050 it was predicted that around 3.5 billion people across the world could be fed without synthetic fertilizers. In that same time frame, with the addition of artificial fertilizers, in the same time frame, around 7.5 billion people could be fed. So this is how successful, if you like, we have been in developing food systems, but with that corresponding rise in human population. So the challenge for us is that when we get to 2050, and we do manage to build our food systems to incorporate this 70% more food that's needed, the narrative doesn't stop there. We haven't achieved anything. We'll have to start again because our population will carry on unless we do something about this. So what role does farming play in the degradation of the landscape? Well, our current farming practices are contributing 1/3 of our global greenhouse gas emissions, and animals are playing a large part in that narrative, not just with carbon dioxide, but with methane and nitrous oxide. And a recent article that was published in PLOS Climate shows that if we phased out animal production pretty quickly, we could achieve a stabilisation of greenhouse gases for the next 30 years, and we could offset nearly 70% of our carbon emissions within this century. And this is compelling evidence for why animal farming is not sustainable, at least as it's currently practiced. And then when we look at the energy that's required to produce meat, at least in current systems, we can also see that that's really energy dense, and it doesn't look a very efficient way of producing meat. So beef is at the top, and I say largely meat, because actually eggs and whole milk down the bottom are using much less energy in comparison, according to this calculation. So at the top, they've calculated that 25 kilos of feed are needed to produce 1 kilo of meat. And so here are some more newspaper headlines for how the narrative has been going around our food systems. So, eat no meat and no animal products, so going for a vegan diet. So we've got responses to this. We've got science for eating no meat and science against eating no meat. We've got industry lashback. We've got alternative viewpoints. We've got technological responses, so effectively laboratory meat. And we've got people appealing for the approach of eating less but better. So lots of diverse belief systems and approaches. Now, what you've heard so far, you hopefully would have had some kind of emotional response, and whether you agree or disagree with some of the things or all of the things that I've said. And this is largely down to your own ethical position. The 4 main positions I've put up here, because I think it's really important to help us understand why we can see the same information and all come to very, very different understandings of whether that is good, bad, wrong, right information. So these, as I say, are the main 4 positions. An anthropocentric position: only humans have intrinsic value. And that's not to say that animals don't have value in the system. Welfare can be important, but it's in its biological functioning sense. So here, intensive farming is acceptable. The zoocentric position believes that animals do have sentience and that these sentient animals have their own value. But this is a utilitarian approach, so that whilst you accept that animals can suffer, if in that suffering there are greater benefits, then it is accepted. So, for example, the testing of animals for medicines would be an acceptable activity with the zoocentric approach. With the biocentric approach, all entities, every single living thing has its own value. And here, no killing is accepted. So here, for example, a vegan might position themselves, or a Buddhist might position themselves in the biocentric position. The reality is, of course, that death is part of life, so it's very, very difficult to uphold this absolutely. And then finally, you have the ecocentric view, where all species and ecosystems have values, but it is accepted that some killing does happen if that doesn't threaten the system or the species. Now, of course, we don't position ourselves only in one of these places. So, for example, you might be a vegan, but use medical products. So we can switch back and forth according to how it suits our ethical ideas, I guess. Yeah, so in farming, we've got essentially three major actors. We've got the humans, we've got the animals, and we've got the landscapes in which they and we live. And I've sort of weighted the titles of these three edges to show how unequal they are, really. Most of what happens in the landscape and towards the animals is really directed towards human interests. But if we're arguing, as the data suggests, that the current farming systems are unsustainable, then perhaps it's time that we looked at how we shift the balance between these relationships and maybe looked at a more equal relationship. So instead of having this top-heavy interests towards humans, that we flip this onto a more parallel plane and rebalance the relationship between the three and affording the other two players a better part. So then if we look at the domestic animals and their roles in this food chain, if you like, they also have three roles. So they have their role as producing food for humans. They have a role in the farming landscape, so in mixed farming systems and providing nutrients for that system. And they have their own intrinsic role in the ecological system. So if we disregard human food currently and look at the farm system, the increase in fertilizer prices, if you like, has raised the consciousness of old-fashioned practices of bringing in grass lays and animals back into our arable systems. And we all now recognise the benefits of this. So managing weed problems, the grasses themselves improving soil fertility. But from the animal point of view, and for me this is a really important point, it makes space for access for other species other than humans. It gives the landscape also back to these other animals, not just as a source of food, but as a landscape to be lived in by these other species. And they themselves can offer soil fertility and other benefits which are associated to biodiversity. That includes increasing the number of trophic levels with which insects can live and thrive in, as well as offering better places for ground nesting birds and, for example, bringing dung beetles in. So if we look at them as part of the functioning ecosystem, I've pulled this off the DEFRA website, where they say the best way to conserve habitats is by traditional grazing, otherwise known as conservation grazing. And they list the different habitats that are suitable for such conservation grazing: grassland, heathland, wood pasture, coastal floodplain, scrub, salt marsh and sand dunes. But we all recognise that overgrazing has degraded a lot of these landscapes, but we don't give enough credence to the fact that undergrazing can also degrade these landscapes. And so getting this right, acknowledging the importance and the position of these animals within these landscapes is critical for us to get it right. And of course, from the animals' point of view, they belong in these landscapes. they have the behaviours that function in these landscapes as long as we don't breed them too far away from those positions. And I would add that it isn't that we've bred the behaviours out of them. Quantitatively, we may have changed their behaviours over the thousands of years of domestication, but qualitatively, they are still the same animals, and they know how to function in these landscapes. The challenge for us is that when we make them into high production animals, they can no longer survive because the requirements are too great for them to keep producing. So what if we disregard food entirely? Would it be possible to say that these systems can be no-killing systems? Well, we could, of course. But if we look at what let's say the UK landscape as it currently is, we've got two populations, free-roaming populations that are essentially out of control. The rabbits are now struggling with diseases, but before then, rather than harvesting them as a good, clean food source, we, humans, chose to give them a debilitating disease as a method of control. I mean, it's essentially an incredibly cruel way of going about having a relationship with the landscape. Red deer, the population have now exploded, or deer in general, the populations have now exploded so that there are biodiversity crises around the corner. If we look at the rewilding example in the Netherlands, where they populated a landscape, fenced in, and then did nothing, with no predators in this landscape, the population absolutely ballooned, and it ended up with, I don't know what the equivalent of a humanitarian crisis. It is absolute cruelty to leave these animals to starve to death, or to kill them just before they starve to death, in their thousands, and breaking down the biodiversity elements at the same time. So we have to recognise that population control is a fundamental requirement for most species on the planet. There is very little evidence, apart from apex predators, there is no evidence that any species can control its population according to available food sources. We are all reliant upon some kind of external control or self-imposed control, perhaps in the sense of humans. So what I'm appealing for, I guess, is that there is a place for human food, animal-derived products, but that this should come as a consequence of planetary health and ecosystem health, first and foremost. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. I always say you need a researcher in the room because I don't think how she thinks, and it's brilliant. So I love the triangle. I think rebalancing the way it looks is the way to go. And thanks for getting us started with that real sort of just overview and pull back into the topic we're talking about. Simon is up next. I will let you take the stage.
Can you tell me after five minutes?
Have a look at her.
Oh, I can't find my glasses, so I hope I can read all that. In the absence of a blackboard, no, are they my glasses? No. In the absence of, I've only got 15 minutes. In the absence of a blackboard, I'm going to have to demonstrate a classic hockey stick graph going like that, right? Okay, going that way. And on the horizontal axis, that is the amount of meat or livestock rearing that society indulges in. And on the vertical axis, that's environmental impact, right? And so right down the bottom here, we have what I call default agriculture, or default livestock. And that means, and probably have to get this right because I actually defined it. Well, in fact, it's defined by the FAO initially, but it's defined as animal products that arise as the integral co-product of a wider agricultural system. So right at the bottom, the lowest impact, I take to be the livestock that are fed primarily or entirely on waste products. And for some reason, this aspect of animal rearing seems to be neglected, particularly by the people who oppose livestock. It in fact constitutes at the moment about 25% of all livestock are fed on various forms of waste product, if you can call it waste. You shouldn't really call it waste. These include crop residues, processing waste, slaughterhouse waste. I will borrow the glasses. Thank you. And consumer waste from canteens and food and so forth. At the moment, as I said, this constitutes about 25% of all animal feed globally. There was a paper in Nature recently that said that this could be expanded so that a further 15% of food could be supplied simply by, in fact, processing waste that weren't being used at the moment. There's a lot of work on this been done by various people like Hannah van Zandt. For example, if you eat an entirely vegan diet, no meat at all, no dairy, the processing waste coming out of that diet over a year, it constitutes about she calculated 129 kilos of feed, which then she calculated provide globally everybody with roughly a third of their protein needs. It is not negligible, but it seems to be ignored. The main recipient of this is, in fact, pigs, and it could be pigs, and in fact, pigs could eat a lot more. They used to when swill was part of the whole cycle of distribution of food waste, which got completely messed up by the British, by the foot and mouth fiasco. I won't go any further into that, though I could. Similarly, with slaughterhouse waste, that got messed up by the British with the BSE crisis. So that's now goes to landfill or is burnt. Back on the continent now we've left Europe. Europe has rescinded the ban on slaughterhouse waste, and that is now being fed. Pig waste is being fed to chickens. Chicken waste is being fed to pigs to keep things separate. What happened when they banned slaughterhouse waste in 2001, around then, was immediately we started importing loads of soybeans from South and North America. And in fact, there's a woman called Sandrine Nonhable who calculated the amount of nutrients in the slaughterhouse waste that was no longer being used, exactly commensurate with the amount of soya that was being imported by the EU. So that's what I call, that's the most basic form of default agriculture. Along with that, an equally low impact insofar as the waste is low impact because it's just, they're being fed stuff that would otherwise go out of the food system. A further form of default livestock is all the bloodlines and the associated with draft animals. That is kind of negligible in this country, but then you go to India, where the entire cow system, the sacred cow system, is basically designed to support millions and millions of bullocks. It's gradually going down as tractors come in, but that is another form of default livestock. Now, how much? 5 minutes. Oh dear, I'm never going to finish. If you go a little bit up the curve. Then you come to the grazing, and in this case, we're using livestock to clear land for one reason or another, and there's all sorts of reasons why land needs to be cleared. It's either for conservation purposes, or for fire regimes, solar panels, golf clubs even. I can show you a golf club where it's kept bottomed out by horses and sheep. The other necessity for grazing animals is for fertility harvesting. Now, this isn't happening much at the moment, perhaps, but we have to get rid of fossil fuels. When we get rid of fossil fuels, we are going to lose all the already expensive nitrogen fertilizers, and we may well have to go back to systems that I was familiar with when I was young and I lived in France, where sheep, which now are only used for meat and are the target of the Monbios of this world, will actually become far more necessary, A, for harvesting food and bringing them in and folding them on land, or as they do in France, bring them in and stick them in the bergerie and get this wonderful, expensive manure that gets put on the vines. Are we going to see that come back? I hope so, because then the sheep will come back and fulfill their true role, which is, first of all, as fertility providers, and secondly, as wool, because we won't have all the plastic clothing. We'll have good, honest woolen clothing again, I hope. Next, as it goes up the line, the other form of grazing is basically, well, dairy cows. And I could talk for 25 minutes about dairy cows, but I can't. So if you've got any questions about dairy cows, the one thing I will say is that what people keep ignoring is that the yield of dairy is about 3 times as high as the yield of beef. That's not to say we should stop beef. Dairy cows produce beef cows. But I've got 8 acres. I get 1,000 litres per acre of grade 4 land with my Jersey cows. If you multiply that by the 20 million, well, 1,000 litres provides enough protein and enough fat for 2 people and enough carbohydrate for 1 person. If you multiply that by the 20 million acres, 25 million acres of permanent grassland around this country, you've fed about half the population. Well, okay, they're not all going to drink milk and eat milk, but that's the amount of nourishment you can get off pretty rubbishy permanent grass. And that's nothing compared to what you can get off ryegrass, herbal lays that are part of a mixed road arable rotation. Mr. Monbiot, who I'm sure you're familiar with, among the many canards in his book, he claims that dairy requires 27 square meters to produce 100 grams of protein. Well, I did the calculations for my cows on the grade 4 land, and they require just 10 cubic meters. If you go and look at Farmers Weekly type people who not bothered about the environment at all, they just want to maximize production, they are producing 100 grams of 2 square meters of lay in a admittedly chemical system, which is exactly the same as the figures that Monbiot gives for tofu. Even more disturbing is the fact that this is confirmed in a paper, a meta-study which covers 12 different studies of dairy production by a gentleman called Dirk Nijdam. And I found Dirk Nijdam's paper in Regenesis. It's quoted by George Monbiot, but it's not quoted by George Monbiot when it contradicts this ridiculously enormous figure that he gives for the yields, which incidentally he gets from the World in Data, or what's it called? Yes, Hannah Ritchie. Our World in Data, yes. Right, okay. Well, this is a long 5 minutes, great. we're getting now to the top of the hockey stick, right, where we've got grain production, right? And this is actually really pretty high impact, a lot of it. But even so, there is a certain amount of that grain which needs to be fed to animals. And the reason it needs to be fed to animals is because we need what's called a feed buffer. Because if you only sow what's necessary to feed people in a bad crop year, then you're not going to have enough grain so to feed people in a good crop year. You're not going to have enough grain to feed people in a bad crop year. So you have to sow enough grain to cover the worst possible year. Well, I've looked at the figures of this. The difference between the worst grain year, running up to about 2010 for 50 years, and the best grain year is about 50 kilos of grain per person. And you've got to have that feed buffer in there so that any year other than the worst possible year, you've got enough grain to feed everybody. And when you've got a surplus, what do? You feed it to animals, because that's the most efficient thing to do with it. It's more efficient than sticking it into cars. So, although the high impact bit of the stick, which actually is only 15% of all global feed for animals, that bit is manifestly unsustainable, except for the fact that we need a feed buffer. And I would say what I've tried to do is show you how all these animals are necessary part of an agricultural system, whatever agricultural system we embrace. There will always be livestock that we need for one reason or another, and when there's too many of them, we might as well eat them, and we certainly need to milk them more.
Thank you, Simon. I love your energy, and I love the hockey stick, the virtual hockey stick. It will stay there. We'll frame it. Richard, you're up next. Thank you very much.
If anybody can lend me a hockey stick for the next time, that would be great.
Well done. That's brilliant. Are you going up? No.
Homework down there, everyone.
I'll tell you when you've got 5 minutes left.
I've got 5 minutes.
I'll tell you when you've got bags of time.
It's a good job they worked.
That's not my slide. Gosh. It is my slide. So that's supposed to be my starting slide, but clearly not what it looks like normally. I don't know what system this is on. Welcome to Yatesbury House Farm. I am Richard Gantlett, as you've heard, and I'm very excited to be here and honoured to be asked to talk and share my thoughts and experiences with you. For a moment, transport yourselves to Yatesbury. That's our farm near Avebury in Wiltshire. So to the mystical land of stone circles and rolling hills, bizarrely called Downs. Yes, we are on the edge of the Marlborough Downs. This is a drone shot of our farm at sunrise on a misty morning. You have to imagine it. So this slide was from another presentation, and right at the bottom here, there was a bit that I was going to delete, and you can't read it anyway. But it says, which is sequestering, that's capturing from the air, 10 times more carbon than it is emitting. I'll just let you absorb that for a moment. You've heard it from Matt already. So I thought actually that point's really important. In the right situation, cattle can help us store carbon, a lot of carbon. And many of you will be doing the same, and you just don't know it, perhaps. But that isn't what I came to talk about. So good job for you, Matt. So it's wonderful to have so many passionate people in the room. And just to gauge where your passions are, I'd like to take or check that you're all awake and do a quick straw poll. So I'm going to read through these in case you can't see them. And then the second time I read through, I'd just like you to put your hands up as to which one most connects with why you're in the room, which one you're most passionate about. So the first one is farmers or land managers need to make a profit. Second one is we need food and fiber, clearly fiber for clothes and not for your breakfast cereal. Thirdly, good land provides clean water, clean air, reduces flood and drought. So that's functioning of the land. Fourth one, how the landscape looks and holds biodiversity. Fifth, how we value the livestock, and not in monetary terms. And lastly, where we place ourselves with nature. So hopefully everyone's got that. If you can do a quick count of who's connected with what one. So first we have farmers, the business aspect, if you like. And just put your hand up if that's why you're in the room. You're here from a business point of view and making a profit. Okay, you might be interested in this book. I've brought some reading for you, some homework. So, Systems Agriculture by Mr. Spedding, Professor Spedding, excellent man who died a few years ago, I think. We need food and fiber. So we need to produce food. Is that what brought you to this room? Yeah. You only put your hand up once, please. So third one, good land provides clean water, clean air, reduces flood and drought. So the functioning of the soil, and perhaps you'd like to read this book. Person who inspired me enormously, died a few years ago, Alex Podolinsky. He's a biodynamic farmer in Australia. Completely, had so many wonderful ideas. Can't encourage you to read his books more. Excellent man. Then we're on to how the landscape looks and holds biodiversity. Hopefully we got some people. Yes, good. That's quite a big topic, to be honest, and particularly involved in perhaps the wildlife organisations, which I'm involved with in Wiltshire, for example, or National Trust. People like that might be particularly interested. Which book should we have for that? Fertility farming, perhaps. Lovely book by Newman Turner, really inspirational about diverse layers, which we use at home. And then, we're talking about value of, did we ask a value of livestock? No, so next is value of livestock, how we value livestock. Excellent, a few more people. A little known book. It's the silent spring of the animals, if you like, livestock. It's called Animal Machines. It was written 2 years after Silent Spring, and the foreword was by Rachel Carson, actually, really good. And is still relevant today, even though we've come a long way since 1964, when that was first read. And then lastly, where we place ourselves with nature. And those who went to Satish Kumar's talk prior to this will perhaps engage with that. And a lovely book I'm sort of in the middle of, The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. Absolutely stunning, fantastic book. So that's the homework. So, back to Yatesbury House Farm in Wiltshire. So now to tell you a bit about how our livestock fit into our landscape. We farm around 1,600 acres, as you've heard, mostly silty clay loam, but also some light chalk. We grow cereal crops, diverse lays, both of which cultivate our soil. We do also look after cattle. We have about 100 cows and their offspring, and they also enhance the soil and cultivate it. To enable this, we use a system of rotational grazing. And we use electric fences, so we have a boundary fence around our farm, So from a practical point of view, we use electric fences to divide up the fields in springtime when the plants are growing quickly. We want the cattle to develop their herd instinct. And that's the really important bit. To move together, to graze together, to drink together, and to lie down together. We aim to move the cattle to fresh pasture before the plants that they've eaten regrow. And that, in the spring, is sort of about 5 or 6 days. And that means it's not too much work for us. In the autumn, it could be a month. So when we're busy harvesting, we don't move them so often because we don't need to. So I hope you can see that. Here we can see our cattle on what seems to be the wrong side of the fence. But actually, they're supposed to be in the wood. That's part of our system. Oh, the red's turned to blue. So grazing in woodlands is part of our system. So you can see just here, you can see the photo up there. So the cows are here along this fence line. This is woodland here underneath the yellow. And this is a big green field of pasture. So the blue, between the blue lines is where they would have been grazing, and then walking around, and at 11 o'clock every morning you can find them in the wood. You could set your clock by it. It's extraordinary. It's like they're going to have a cup of coffee. It's just a joy to see them doing that. So this is what we call our forest farm approach. So the cattle can roam, they can browse, which gives them a diverse nutrition, and they can shelter from rain and sun. So the photo you saw before was taken in 2022, and this was taken a year later, this summer. And you can see here the woodland. It's much greener on the bottom than it would have been when the cows are in there. And they've spread the seed around, and on the right-hand side, which is a focus close-up of that, you can see clover plants growing. So a real development of the understory in the woodland area. So our goals for this forest farm approach are cattle to be able to access the whole farm eventually in autumn, so they'll just be able to wander and go where they want to, but we'll fence off our crops. So clearly we don't want them to be walking on our freshly planted fields. But that slightly turns it on the head. You know, we'd be fencing off our crops rather than fencing in our cattle. We want to plant more trees, particularly around the dew pond that you can see there where the cattle are lying. And that's a cactus guard protecting a tree that's been planted there. We want to really let the cattle have more space to help them develop this herd instinct, the intelligence that goes with it. So this is an insight into how we look after our cattle. We have some vegan friends, which may surprise you given that I'm a beef farmer. But actually, my wife and farming partner is vegetarian, which also may be confusing. But the questions or the challenges have been really important over the years, and indeed formative. And for example, in 2019, we did a farm carbon audit, which I've alluded to check on our cattle emissions after the methane issue was brought to our awareness. And as you saw on the first slide, we are storing 10 times more carbon than we are emitting. So that's really very heartening. I remember having discussions about the value of our cattle on our farm around our kitchen table many years ago with Paul, one of our vegan friends from London, who said, "So the cattle sound great. They are clearly beneficial to the landscape, but why do you have to kill them?" And without a pause, "Well," said one of my sons, aged 14, "we have to make money. We do indeed need to grow food, but also truly respect and revere our cows and our cattle, towards maybe how the Indians and the Nepalese do." So here's a cow that lives in a Hindu temple in Tamil Nadu. And at the bottom, you can just about make out a yak in the Langtang Valley of Nepal. Both of these are revered because they give unconditionally their milk. But plants are sentient beings too. On our farm, we aim to respect all life: soil life, plants, animals, wildlife, and humans. So, what is the answer as to which food and fibre to buy? Well, for me, it's easy. It's not the type of food that's important, but it's the system that the food has been grown in. Let's all remember to ask where the beef or the chicken or the soya comes from and how it's farmed, or indeed the wool or the cotton, for that matter. Your support for farmers all over the planet, producing food in a biodiversity-enhancing way and without the use of toxins, that's organic or biodynamic in case you're not sure, is the quickest way to reverse both the biodiversity crisis and climate change, but also secure a healthy food production for the future, for our children. Hope you can read that. So, I'll just leave you with these thoughts. If we could listen more to nature, plants and animals, fungi and insects, how would nature tell us to farm? If we could talk to cows, well, actually any cow farmer here probably does that already, and they would tell you stories about cows communicating with them, like our cow Toffee, who came up to me one day when we were in the shed asking her for help with a difficult calving. But what would the world be like if we were all, or even if we had nature on our teams, but were all consciously, perhaps on nature's team, so to speak? Wouldn't farming be much easier? Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, folks, thank you. We're going to sort of change into a bit of a discussion now. I've got quite a few questions if you don't, but I'd much rather hear from you than myself. We've got one question online, so anyone online, please put some more questions into the chat. Does anyone have anything to say? Comments, questions, criticisms, anything? At the back there, yes. Yeah, it'd be great if you could say your name as well, please.
Sorry, thank you. My name is Robin Maynard, and for my sins, I have just stepped down as Executive Director of Population Matters. So I wanted to thank Lindsay for mentioning the elephant in the room of human population growth. It's the one species we're very bad at counting. And it's the one species we can manage very well through humane, compassionate, and ethical means, namely giving girls access to education and women choice over how many children they have or whether and when they have them, and that's denied to hundreds of millions of women in the world currently. My question really is, because all the things we're talking about here in terms of regenerative agriculture, resilient systems are fantastic, and I've supported these for all my years working for Friends of the Earth and the Wildlife Trust, etc. But those in the other conference down the road, the agribusiness boys, and they mostly are boys, don't believe you can feed the world because there are 10 billion people coming and more. That's only the median projection, and that's only if we do all the good things we're doing for development and progressive population solutions in terms of contraception and education. So somehow you have to address this issue of human population in a grown-up, humane way, which my colleagues in Africa and India and Latin America are very good at doing and open to talking about, but we don't talk about it in the NGOs, which are largely headed up by white, middle-aged males like me in the UK and Europe. We have to get over this old stigma, because it's such a positive way forward, and the solutions are so progressive, and they will enable the organic and biodynamic and regenerative agriculture movement to thrive and flourish, and to push back at those old dinosaurs down the road. Thank you.
Lindsay, do you want to get us started?
It didn't sound like a question, but I really thank you for standing up, because I was really quite worried about raising it as a topic today. So thank you for bringing your view and much better knowledge than I have on the topic.
Anyone else? Any other population?
Well, I'd just like to say that Robin contributed to the land. I completely agree with what Robin's saying, and I think a lot of people try to neglect or fail to fully consider the population problem. I'd just like to say that the Land magazine did an issue on population. I think it was issue 13 or 14. Robin contributed. It had 2 rabbits on the front by Agnes Millipata, and it had about 200 rabbits on the back by Gustave Doré. And if you want a copy, we haven't got any here, but you can get it from the Land magazine. But thank you, Robin, for bringing that up.
Thanks, Robin. Just in front of Robin, we've got this, someone there.
Hi, my name is Angelica. I'm a beef farmer in Cambridge. I find it really difficult to marry up the first with the last talk, because as a beef farmer, I worry very much about my impact on the environment. Do I produce food that is that I can really justify? And I really feel that I haven't been given an answer between those 2 talks. Is there a way that I can produce good beef, not damage the climate with methane, and I can justify running my cattle?
Thank you. Richard, do you want to jump on that?
Indeed. I thought I did answer that question, but perhaps you won't. I could talk it through again afterwards if you like. So that's exactly what we're doing. We are producing beef in a holistic system. We don't bring stuff onto the farm. It's a closed farming system. We employ a whole farm approach in that, as you've seen, our woodland is part of the farm, just as our wheat crops are part of the farm, but we don't treat them separately. The pests that might attack our wheat crops actually have predators in the woodland, so we need to look at this whole ecosystem altogether in one farm organism. And I think what you're worried about, and the question I keep being asked, and what was alluded to a moment ago, is about yield. And I'm just slightly perplexed by the question is, why are we so fixed on yield? Firstly, we've already heard about waste, food waste. A third of our food is being wasted. Secondly, there are 3 times more obese people on the planet than there are hungry people. And it's awful that there are hungry people, but it's not a shortage of food. Okay? Conventional farming does not feed the planet. Most food comes out of native production systems which are naturally organic. Yeah? Industrial farming doesn't feed indigenous populations. So those things are really important to start off with. You know, what is this over yield, if you like, going towards, what is it feeding? What is that extra production of wheat that my neighbor has? Where does it go? It goes to feed pigs and poultry in intensive farming systems, which hopefully none of us in the room eat. But, if we want to remove those intensive farming systems, then that food becomes surplus and we don't need to produce it, if that makes sense. We need to be growing our meat and grazing it from pasture, from from plants that we as human beings can't consume ourselves. So that's where beef and dairy comes in. You know, 100% of beef and dairy cows need to be fed on pasture, not cereals. That's terrible. You know, it's so unnecessary. It's just wasteful in my term. I've heard, so I'm going to go on a bit. I've heard several people, and Oliver Wolston was one of those many years ago, talking about how I'm farming for the people. I'm producing food for the people. You guys here at the Soil Association conference, it was in those days, other people might remember the conference as well, saying, oh, you people are trying to look after the planet, but I'm looking after the people. I mean, how short-sighted is that? If you don't look after the planet, there won't be any production facility for future generations. We've got to look after the land and not throw poisons and toxins at the land so that we can produce food in the future. So that's really important as well. We've got to have the right production systems, which goes back to my comment about supporting farmers who are doing the right thing already by buying food from their systems, or fibre or clothing. That's probably enough for me for a moment.
Lindsay or Simon, you got anything to add?
Oh, I do. A couple of things. First of all, I don't quite agree with you about I think yields are extremely important, especially if we are going to pursue organic agriculture. I think it's a huge challenge for those of us who want to get out of the chemical artificial fertilizer treadmill. It's a huge challenge to bring up yields to the point where we can feed 10 million people with a decent amount of protein. But simply because the yields at the moment are much lower than, I'm not saying it can't be done, but it is a huge challenge, and I'd like to see regenerative farmers and organic farmers concentrating more on yield, because otherwise we just won't feed people. The other thing I'd like to say is you're worried about the impact of beef, and most of the criticism on beef is to do with its methane emissions. And the thing with methane emissions is if you've got a stable herd of beef, either globally or just on your farm, then you have stable emissions of methane, and you're not increasing the amount of global warming. You're only increasing the amount of global warming if your herd is increasing or the global herd is increasing. So I think it is vitally important not to increase the global herd any further, and in fact it is decreasing in most places except Africa. I'd also say that we need to look a bit more at dairy than at beef, because, as I say, it is 3 times as productive as beef in terms of nutrition for humans.
Yeah, I just really wanted to say something about the biodiversity. I'm going to stay well clear of yield. But I think partly the challenge is external, in that science and research should hopefully provide farmers with the tools to judge how the farm is responding to the level of food production on it. So really the question is whether the nature on your farm is recovering after every depletion, if you like. So after every harvest, you will have changed the situation on the farm, but how quick is it to recover into a good, healthy state again? And that, in terms of planetary health, must be the target. And that's partly related to your local environment, to your own farm environment, and in some ways you will be the best judge of that, but supported by tools from outside. I think that would be the ideal state to get to.
Thanks for your question, Angelica. We're going to go to an online question now.
Okay, so a question here from online. This is from Caroline. The amount of grain fed to intensive white meats, pigs and poultry and pheasants, what proportion is this of animal feed grain?
Pop quiz.
Well, 15%. I think I said that in my talk. Yeah.
15%.
Globally.
Okay. And then we'll go back to the room. Anyone else got a question in the room? This, just on the third row back.
Thanks. I hope this is an acceptable question, because it's very practical.
Yeah, please.
My name's Will. I've been with Livestock about 60 years, and I'm still trying to learn how to do it. Richard, yeah, you were saying that you move your cattle every 5 or 6 days. Now, when we had the dairy herd, they had a fresh bite after every milking, because that was perfectly natural to them, because in their nature, they came in twice a day for milking and went out to fresh grazing. Now we've got a suckler herd like yours. I started off like that, 4 or 5 days. What I found was, first day, ate the heads off. Second day, produced extra milk for the calves. Third day, the calves expected more milk, but it was easing off. Fourth day, everybody was discontented. So we went to the daily move. And that works very well. It's a lot more work, works very well. But listening to you and also Lindsay talking about what's best for the animals, the space they need to have natural behaviors, sometimes we get worried that we're cramping them up too much. Talking about what Simon was saying about yield, I suspect that our system is the best for yield because it's the best manuring and the best regrowth, because we're growing cereals as well, relying on that manure. So I'm sort of puzzled as to, are we slightly overstocked, which is why having a few more days doesn't work. But if we're overstocked and we lessen the stock, we'll have less manure, less arable crops. And Simon was saying, well, you organic farmers aren't producing enough output. So I'm just interested in your guys' views as sort of the cattle welfare aspect as against the agricultural production aspect.
Thanks, Will. Lindsay, do you want to?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpick there. And of course, we don't know all of the answers because we keep trialing these new systems. And as you say, based on output rather than good animal welfare. And then we sort of look at the animal welfare as a secondary aspect, and we don't have enough answers about that yet. I would say, so if we're talking about mob grazing, I would say that there are very real risks of overstocking in the sense that you're overcrowding the animals. So natural spacing, if you watch animals grazing, the natural distance that they hold between each other is between 4 to 10 meters. So if you're encouraging them to graze closer together and you're bringing in an element of competition for food, then you're starting to change their behaviour. So they're eating more quickly, or perhaps if you're moving them without considering normal animal behaviour patterns, where particularly cattle are meal feeders, and then they will rest, ruminate, digest, and then they will have another meal. But if you're not observing these patterns and you're moving them out of sync with their natural patterns, then you're encouraging them to take on fresh food on top of partially fermented food, and then you're disrupting the digestive system. So there are a lot of ways in which we can do the animals a disservice if we don't consider them in our daily practices. There's, of course, also the issues of resources available to them. So if you've got a larger field that's been broken down into smaller paddocks or cells, whether shade or shelter is available to them, whether the land is appropriate for that number of animals to be grazing on it at any particular time of year. These are also other things to consider. So whilst I don't have concrete answers for you, I think your question is absolutely valid in that, are we doing them a full service in terms of themselves and their welfare when we are chasing production, optimal production, or and could we continue with that with a few tweaks and get it right on both counts? I think that still has to be answered.
Yes, I mean, you make very good points, Will, and I totally take on board what you said. The thing is, every farm is different. Every farmer is an individual, and one of the first things I often say when people come to my farm, look, this is how we run our farm. Someone else would come here and do it differently. The most important thing you talked about was observation. And observation is the greatest life skill any of us can develop. And it's not necessarily seeing what's in front of you, but it's seeing what the processes that are going on beyond that, underneath the soil, if you like, how the plants are, how the cows are reacting to what we're doing, and intuiting those processes. And anyone who wants to come and carry on the conversation of how you observe nature, communicate with nature, come tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock in the woodshed. We're having exactly those discussions. So it's going to be a really interesting talk. But yes, there's no right or wrong answer. I think there's only a balance, and it's something that we don't get it right on our farm all the time, but that's the essence of how we're working, and it sits with the cows look pretty healthy at the moment, so I'm taking that health of the livestock as a good indicator of whether they're enjoying the process, enjoying the life they're in, and the system that they're experiencing, if you like.
Anything, Simon, to add?
Only to say that I give my dairy cows, Jerseys, bit of fresh grass every morning, well, when they're out, and I move the back feds about every 5 or 6 days, like yours. So they get some fresh stuff, but that stops them going back and hammering the stuff they've already eaten. Otherwise, they let me know what they want.
Well, they're Jerseys.
Thanks, Will. Any other questions out there? At the back in the blue shirt.
Thank you. Mike Roberts, from a beef farmer from Cornwall. A couple of questions. Firstly, for the guy on the population side of things, I wonder if in his meetings he actually talked about sterilisation. Might be a question that come back, but I think probably if we were to farm sustainably and regeneratively, then food wouldn't be the problem. If we fast forward 400 years to 24, I think probably our biggest problem is going to be other resources and not food, as a way we're mining the landscape. You know, all what we've got here comes from below the ground, doesn't it? So it's those resources which can be more of a problem than food, I think. And then it goes on to actually the other question I'd like to ask the panel. Farmers have been labelled to feed the world. Is this something that you think we have got to do, should do? You know, I'm a handful of the farmers, one of the handful in this room which actually put their hand up to say, yeah, we're here to make a profit. I believe that our grandparents probably never thought about feeding the world. They thought about feeding their family and looking after their business. Farmers need to make a profit, especially on a family farm. Otherwise, you lose those family farms and you haven't got succession. And then it's a case that the land then goes to the bigger guys. So it's monoculture farming. So yeah, that's the question I'd like to ask the population guy and also the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. We're going to start with that. Should farmers be thinking about feeding the world, or should they be thinking about feeding their community?
Well, I think the farmers, as you say, mainly think about feeding themselves and making a profit. But it's the onus is on governments and economists to see that the world is fed, and in order for them to see that, they got to give a good price to the farmers, and that's the way it works. If you're not getting a good price, then you go up to the economists and the government. You say we need a decent price, and the government has to listen, because otherwise they won't feed people. It's the onus is on the policymakers to feed the world.
Lindsay?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do agree with that, but I think there are more layers that are players in this, and I suppose, you know, the obvious one is supermarkets fixing prices to suit them rather than fair recompense for effort, and I mean, it's actually really sad that we're talking about profit. Of course, people should make a profit for energy. If you're working at something and producing something, you should be able to be fairly recompensed for whatever it is that you've produced at the end of any day, in whatever role you have. So actually, it grieves me to see that it's separate, because I see that as a fundamental building block of a society. You work at something and you get paid for it, and you get paid fairly. And so it shouldn't be a discussion, even though it is. In terms of feeding the world, I do actually believe it is at those higher levels where the focus of feeding the world should sit, because it isn't for any one farmer to attempt to feed the world. It can't possibly be achieved. The best thing any farmer can do is to feed its local environment, and whatever then is left becomes part of feeding the world.
Richard, could you talk a little bit about where you sell your grain within the context of this conversation, with this question?
Yes, I wanted to talk just
Go for
directly on this question, and I'll do that. So one of the questions I often ask when I'm asked to speak is what it is that farmers do. What, in one word, how can you sum up what we do as farmers? And I think it's health, in one word. We need to be producing health. That's health on the farm in terms of the biodiversity, in terms of the soil, in terms of the wildlife, health in our livestock, but producing healthy food that then nourishes people into health, which then is infectious. Health is infectious as well, yeah? And if we're producing healthy food, that is great. We're then not spending so much on our health system, and we're all happier people. So I think it's health that we need to be producing, not feeding the world. It's a wrong target. If we're producing healthy food, we might have a little bit less of it, but actually that probably will make us healthier, given that 3 times as many people are obese rather than hungry. So you're asking about where we sell our cereals. So yeah, someone was asking me this the other day, and I was thinking, oh, well, it depends on the market, you know, as to what cereals we grow. And I thought, actually, no, it's completely changed. People come to us and ask us to grow a particular cereal or a particular variety because of how we do it. And people are engaged with that. And so we're supplying processors, really, millers, distillers, and even our beef goes partly to a farm shop. So it's about real connection with people directly, and that's so valuable for me. It really warms our heart, gives a lot of joy to be feeding people directly rather than supplying into some big commodity system. So that's also of great value.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Mike.
Sorry, can I just add one thing? Well, I do recognise that there is a real challenge with our responses, though. Feeding locally, of course, is the ideal. But if you live in an environment where the predominant production is grain, and there's very little else that's grown in that region, then it becomes very challenging as an individual to have an enriched diet, if you like. So I absolutely do recognise that, at least with current systems, there are limitations with the ideal response of feeding locally.
Thank you, Mike. Mike, I'll let you talk to Robin about your question directly to try and keep on track. Chat next to Mike at the back, pink shirt.
Thank you. Yes, it's Andrew Brewer. Live very close to in Cornwall to Mike. Dairy farmer, regeneratively farming as well, and rearing and finishing our beef cattle from the dairy herd. A question for Richard, really, a little bit more detail on the balance of your cropping, how much percentage of cropping compared to grassland to get that positive carbon balance. What are you doing? Are you going to looking to get compensation from the market for you sequestering all that carbon in the future?
I just missed the end bit.
Are you going to try and monetize the carbon that you're gaining into your land?
Sure. Yeah, so just in case anyone's interested in the principles of having a healthy farm, there's a little leaflet here produced by the Organic Research Centre. It's a project that I was involved with, and a few other farmers who at the conference were involved with. Do pick one up at the end. So yes, a little more detail. It's about 40% pasture, diverse lays, 60 cereals. So one of the things my on-farm research showed that we used 2 years of pasture. Actually, it was much less pasture, 2 years of pasture, and I think it was 5 years of cropping. One of those was a green manure, which led to the enormous amounts of carbon that we happen to be storing. So you could do quite a lot of cropping with a small amount of pasture. What we also found was that there will be a peak to the amount of carbon, those who know about these things, that you store. But in our diverse lay, if you keep the diverse lay in place, so it was there for 5 years in total, we found no peak, so the carbon just kept growing. So we know if we can lengthen our lay phase, because we use 23 different species, we're going to use even more than that next year, 23 different species at the moment in our diverse lays. So we know that that interaction of the roots in the soil, that's where it all happens in the soil. It's not above ground, it's the roots going down, but the plants need to go up as well. So that root activity is what stores the carbon, because that brings more life into the soil. So we didn't set out to store carbon, that's really important. We set out to bring more life into the soil. And it just happens to be a convenient measure. And your last question, are we going to monetize it? We haven't done yet. I did speak to someone about it, and they said, oh, you've done it already, we can't pay you for doing that. I'm thinking, yeah, fine, okay. Our system and our farming system benefits from what we've done anyway. We're getting huge benefits all the time from what we've done because of increased fertility, better functioning of the soil in all aspects, water and air in the soil and life in the soil. So we are monetizing it in the productivity of the farm, yes. But directly, I haven't found a suitable way of doing that. I'm not sure there is. It's, yeah.
Thank you. We're going to jump to a question from the live stream.
Yeah, so Richard, for you, this is how many head of cattle do you rotate on your land, and do you house them over winter?
Yes, we house them over the winter. That's the easy one. So they're all housed. We do have a small amount of land where we could outwinter some now, but we didn't initially. It has our cattle calve in the winter inside from the middle of January. So that makes part of our farming system work easier when they're calving inside. They run in the winter when it's raining, and they run out in the spring. So they enjoy both processes. And I think they're probably happy to be inside today. They have plenty of space inside. So we have space that tend to be roofs with lots of fresh air. So inside, outside, how many cattle was it? How do we round? So we're 100 cows, so it's about 300 head of cattle. Initially, when they go out, they're with the bulls, so they're in smaller groups with bulls, sometimes with several bulls, sometimes on their own. So it might be a group of 40, or it might be a group of 100. And then calves running with them, of course. The other part of that, then as we take the bulls out, or as the season progresses, they go into bigger paddocks as grass growth slows down, and they end up in one herd. So we run them as one herd. And this is something I'm sort of slightly passionate about, as you probably gathered. So we've run them as one herd so that they all interact together. They know their matriarchy, who's the boss. And there's a bit of a jostling when they go back together again, but essentially they're run as one herd. And in the shed, they're all, the cows are all in one block as well.
Any more questions? Okay, we've got time for one more question from the room. At the back in the middle with the dungarees.
Hiya. Hiya. I had kind of 3 questions in one, all around the same topic. Which carbon auditing tool did you use? And what's your perspective on the fact that different tools seem to produce different results? And are there any tools out there that account for the role of methanotrophic bacteria in pasture land and the effect of digesting the methane?
The tool we use is the Farm Carbon Toolkit. I don't have any experience directly, but my son did do his dissertation on different carbon toolkits, and he's in the audience down here. I'm going to embarrass him. You can ask him afterwards. I sort of missed the other bit, which was about soil bugs, and sounded very interesting.
Methanotrophic bacteria,
Yes.
which live in healthy pastureland and digest methane. And I'm just wondering if there are any tools that account for their activity in the soil.
I don't think so. I think one of the problems with the whole methane assessment is that it's taken from cows basically in lab conditions, and nobody really knows quite how much of that disappears to the methanotropes. That's as far as I know, anyway.
Just on that point about the different situations with cattle, one of my colleagues at University of Reading, Chris Reynolds, he's got really excited about diverse layers, herbal layers, because his work has been exactly on this topic of methane, and his work has shown that when you've got diverse layers, lots of biodiversity in the cattle are grazing, the methane emissions from the cattle is much less.
Thanks for your question. Folks, we're going to wrap it up here. We are scratching the surface of a massive topic, so I hope you got maybe 1%, one question answered, 1% improved idea or something. We're going to dive into this a little bit more. I'll just leave you with the fact that Richard said his cows were on the wrong side of the fence. I often feel like I'm on the wrong side of the fence when I think about this stuff. So yeah, stick with us and we'll explore this a bit more. Thank you for your time. Thank you online. Thank you for the panel.